Okay, I'm live. Um, Thanks to another of my tapes on pandemic musings. This is episode 5. And in this one, I ask all of us to stop the lies we're telling each other because it just makes us all more vulnerable to the machinations of those who would create a totalitarian state and march off with our rights and liberties under their arms and in their pockets. First of all, if I may ask again, please, for you to hit the subscribe and notification buttons if you're watching this on YouTube, because it helps me create more content. So, what's the point of this episode? How the pandemic hits you depends on who you are, where you are, and how you are. There is that huge word intersectionality in this. And yet, certain voices have been really amped up to the point where theirs are the only voices and narratives that you hear. Other voices have been really dumbed down so that you don't hear their narrative, you don't hear their stories. Now, it's when you put pressure on people till the pipsqueak, that's when you really get to find out what they're made of. And that's what's happening to all of us under this pandemic, with the various threats to our liberty and so on, which are coming up over the horizon. I'm talking specifically of child vaccination and vaccine passports. Of course, I can't mention vaccine passports without kind of wondering to myself why they have to use all those euphemistic names like Green Pass or Freedom Pass. It's as if they're trying to, in Cockney English, there's this notion of polishing effluence. There is no way you can polish effluence. There is no way you can make it smell like Chanel No. 5. It is what it is. But still, they'll try and dress it up. So, coming back to this idea of intersectionality and differential impacts, I want to talk today about how clear it is to me the prescriptions that are laid out by society for a man like me, a person of African origin. There is a certain look, there is a certain sound, there is a certain narrative, there are certain things that I may and may not talk about. All of these are very clearly prescribed. Most of them abuse my human rights, because the one thing about sovereign liberty is that we have freedom of speech, and the purpose of freedom of speech is for you to tell your story as you have lived it. But when it comes to people of African origin, especially in a broadcasting or journalistic role, there is a look we are supposed to have. And this is mostly because the platforms on which we work are not owned by people who look like us or support our background. They are owned by people who need us to come along and perform a role for their benefit, with no real kind of outputs which are positive for people of African origin. Secondly, there is a sense of worth. Now, this is a post about the lies we tell each other. The prescribed look, sound, narrative that's coming across is something we lie to each other about. We pretend as if there is one objective normal, which is palpably false. Anybody with half an ounce of intelligence will tell you that there is not one truth. There are many facets of a fundamental truth. Then the question of worth. Everybody knows that, especially in Western civilization, there is a totem pole of worth. And owing to our experience, where a lot of people of my ancestry were enslaved, others colonized, becoming part of the British Empire, there is this kind of residual notion underscored by 1,000 micro acts of supremacism, which give If you are a person of European origin, when you see me basically as somebody who is not worth as much as you. And let me tell you, you may give me casual recognition and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter how educated you are, the color denotes the worth. So that's that. So you can't actually, rightly, if this is how you've been trained to think, you can't imagine that I could possibly have anything of real worth or consequence to be sharing with you about what is the greatest existential threat facing mankind, not just in your lifetime and mine, but I would say since the Middle Ages, as recorded in Western history. This is a grand turning point for us all. Now, of course, if you are free, your narrative is based on your lived experience. But if we must lie to each other because we find, first, the prescribed narrative that we're putting across overly dictatorial, unjust, unfair, and so on, we would prefer that nobody mentioned that there is a prescribed narrative. If the totem pole of worth, which has been as culturally ingrained, still exists and still creates massively differential outputs, we would prefer that we didn't talk about it. So again, that's something we'd have to lie to each other about. So in the end, through these lies we maintain and support with each other, when you get a person of African origin in the public space, speaking as either a thought leader, opinion former, a social leader of any kind, the prescribed role in European society is for him to be a performing monkey. A performing monkey, I use that euphemistically, but I use that to demonstrate somebody who does something for the pleasure, the will, the ease, the comfort, the entertainment of their master. We used to live in Pakistan when I was a little boy, and the family was in the diplomatic service there. And they had snake charmers and they had monkey dancers. And these monkeys were amazingly well trained, and they do lots of tricks. And I'd always get from a few rupees from Dad, and that was quite a lot of money. But I'd get some rupees and I'd chuck it at the guy, and he'd be really happy. And after a while, because he was on my way home from school, I'd ask my father or the driver to take me along to this guy so that I could get my little fix of the performing monkey. And he recognized who we were. We'd rock up in a diplomatic car with a flag on the front, and he'd come along and kind of give me a private show. What's not to like? Hey, 7-year-old kid, 8-year-old kid, it's all good fun. But that's the image that comes to my mind when I think of the way mainstream media owners, mainstream media managers ideate people of African origin who are in the media space. Now, that's got to change. And the reason it's maintained is that you and I lie to each other about it. And as far as I'm concerned, all that does is that it reflects a very low vibrational state of life. It's a very egoic state, driven by our perception of our vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities like shame, guilt, fear, and so on, because rightfully, because people of European origin would hate to be in that situation. They imagine that if you let people like me talk about it, we're gonna go bizarre and crazy against the evidence of the entirety of human history. But then that's egoic logic. It is so skewed towards the narrow protection of the individual that it totally forgets its moral, ethical, and wider responsibilities, not only to life, but to the wider society. So here is the thing that actually makes me shed tears. The other thing, like, we're all grown men. Nobody has an easy life. Everybody has their cross to bear. I have mine, you have yours. What makes me want to shed tears, though, is that this idea of prescription, differential worth, skewed narratives to puff up one group and pretend reality isn't happening is actually projected onto the victims of this setup as well. Now, that is heartbreaking, because actually you do find that even when they don't have to, people of African origin often find that they're acting the prescribed role, that they're telling the prescribed narrative, that they're acting the prescribed worth, and that they're maintaining these lies for the betterment, the comfort, the welfare of those who very unjustly gain from this. Now, what's the relevance of this to the pandemic? You see, if you think slightly deeply about this, what you realize is that the very few people with power, the globalists, have so driven this wedge between us all that while we are practicing moral relativism, which is just a posh way of saying hypocrisy, okay? You know, you say one thing, you do another. While we're busy being hypocrites, they are driving a coach and horses through our united ranks. This moral relativism, hypocrisy, these unspoken and but oft repeated, it's an interesting kind of contradiction there. These are unspoken but oft repeated lies actually enable our oppressors. It puts the wind in their sails, and that's why it has got to stop. I'll tell you what I'd like to see. I'd like to see people be themselves. I don't want a Scotsman to be anything other than a Scotsman. I don't want an Irishman to be anything other than an Irishman. I don't want a Welshman to be anything other than an Irishman. I don't want a Ghanaian to be anything other than a Ghanaian, a Nigerian, a South African, an Eritrean, an Eritrean. What the world can't afford is for any of those people to think that they are the final, the ultimate, the single, and the only reality in the world. That means we all must be ourselves, but we must be our highest selves. The self which recognizes the collective worth of our joint humanity. Then everybody can rock their role and do their best. Now, the moment we're able to even think along those lines, the globalists are totally screwed. For two reasons. First of all, when a person is themselves, the first thing that starts to happen is that the fear starts to evaporate. Second thing is that you develop a conscious connection with the entirety of the universe. And that is when you start to recognize that the abuse of the other is the abuse of yourself. Now, I don't know how to put this. This is hard to recognize because, again, it sounds like a huge contradiction because you and the other appear separated, but actually you're not. And the funny thing is, those who are lurching for this global totalitarian dictatorship, which we are on a trajectory to going towards, understand this very well. I'm saying you and I must start to understand it too. The only reason I'm speaking English on this platform is because most of the people out here can only speak English. Actually, the people on the continent tend to be kind of multilingual, but most people in the country in which I live are monolingual. This because Britain has been everywhere, I'm told, except for 22 countries in the world. And she wasn't invited to go to any of those places, usually overstay her welcome. But it is what it is. So don't try and limit me to your limitations. I won't limit my I won't, expect you to limit yourself to my limitations. But don't you dare try and impose your reality, your single, what David I calls your single point of consciousness as the only point of consciousness. And this is the lesson we must all learn. So there we are. It's all about your higher vibrational self, because that is the only self that will tolerate not only your brilliance, but the brilliance of others. Because the truth is, we are all absolutely fabulous as we are. Thanks very much for listening.